If you're doing a CTF, lab, or penetration test against a Windows environment, there's one tool considered the Swiss Army knife of Active Directory exploitation, and that tool is NetExec, formerly known as CrackMapExec. In this video, I will cover the basics of NetExec and show multiple examples of how it can be used to make your next CTF or engagement against a domain much easier. This video will be broken down into 4 major categories based on your current level of access in your environment, starting off with uncredentialed enumeration, to credentialed enumeration and attacks, and then administrator level enumeration. The final category will be some miscellaneous modules that I thought were also worth including, so feel free to skip around the video to find what you're looking for, or watch it all the way through if you've never used the tool before. Let's get started by first talking about what protocols the tool supports. Here on my Kali Linux machine, I've just ran the tool NetExec with no flags, just to get a general overview of what the tool is. If we scroll down to the very bottom, we see the available protocols that the tool supports. In this video, we'll be focusing mainly on SMB and LDAP, because these are the two most common protocols we'll see in an Active Directory environment. But for a lot of the concepts and things I'm going to show you for these protocols, they can be used against other protocols, such as password spraying. So keep that in mind when you come across any of these services running on a host in your environment. If we want to learn more about what we could do with a specific protocol, we can use NetExec, the name of the protocol, and then -- help. And this will give us all of the options and arguments available to us based on the certain protocol that we specified. Now let's start to talk about what unauthenticated enumeration we can do against a domain controller in a Windows environment. Just to give you the layout of my current environment, I've got my Kali virtual machine that can talk to this domain controller right here that has the host name of dco1.cyberryan.local. So we can try to fingerprint that domain controller by doing a netexec SMB and then the host name. And we see we get a response from a Windows Server 2022 with the name dco1 domain cyberryan.local, where SMB signing is set to true and SMB v1 is turned off. If you just had an IP address and you didn't know the name or domain of the host that you're attacking, you could just supply the IP address, and you'd be able to determine that information from this command. We could then check if anonymous SMB access is enabled by specifying the -u parameter or user parameter with just single quotes, and the -p parameter or password parameter as also having single quotes. And if you get back this green plus sign, then you know you have guest authentication enabled in this environment. If this specific variation didn't work, you could also try using the guest user with no password, as well as the guest user with the password guest. In my current environment, we saw that the guest user with no password was successful, but the guest user with the password guest was unsuccessful. Now that we know that guest authentication is successful, we could try to enumerate the SMB shares that exist on the server by using the --shares parameter. And here we get a list of all of these shares that exist on the server, and we can see what specific permissions we have over those shares. So something very interesting would be that we have read-write access to the common share, as well as read access to the IPC share. Since SMB share enumeration is typically a credentialed task, we'll go more into depth into enumerating shares, uploading and downloading files, and looking for sensitive files in the credentialed portion of this video. Another thing we could attempt to do with our anonymous access is to dump all of the users in the environment. The old way of doing this, I believe, was with the SMB protocol, but I think it's been switched to LDAP more recently. So I would attempt both protocols to try and dump local users. In this case here, we see that SMB wasn't able to find anything, and with LDAP we were at least able to authenticate and tried to enumerate domain users, but with guest access we weren't able to dump anything. If we weren't able to determine users with the user's export flag, we may be able to do so with the RID brute force flag, using --RID-brute. RID brute forcing is a technique to try to identify all of the relative IDs in a domain, which could include different users or groups. By default, it's going to check the first 4,000 relative IDs, but we can set this value to whatever we want. In my case here, I'll set it to 10,000, and we're going to be using the SMB protocol to do this. And after we ran the command, we see that we're able to identify a bunch of different relative IDs. We've got the notorious administrator user with RID 500. And if we scroll past all of these normal groups, then we start seeing the different users that exist in the domain, such as Martha Anseli, Norina Camilla. And if we keep scrolling down, it looks like we've got about 100 users in this environment. And at the very bottom, we also have a bunch of different custom groups that were created for this environment as well. We could then rerun this command and do some grep magic on the word sid type user and cut out all the junk to get a list of all of the users that exist in the environment. Now if we cut out users.txt, we see that we've got a nice list of all of the users in our environment that we could then use to do things like password spray, ASRep roasting, things like that. And speaking of password spraying and ASRep roasting, we can do both of those things with this tool. Starting with password spraying, we can just specify the users.txt flag that we just generated in the u parameter, and then specify any password we want in the -p parameter, and it will attempt welcome 1 against all of the users that we already identified. Unfortunately, we don't get any hits, so instead of trying our luck with password spraying, we could instead switch over to the LDAP protocol, specify our users flag to be all of the users that we enumerated, setting our password to nothing, and using the --ASRep roast flag to attempt an ASRep roast attack against the environment, and then any hashes we may discover will be saved to ASRep_roast.out. It looks like we get 2 hits in the environment for aim.erica and carol.carol, and now we could potentially try to crack these hashes using hashcat and a password wordless like rocku.txt. We can also get the password policy of the domain by using the --passpol flag, and this would be useful to know for password spraying in case we don't want to lock anybody out of the environment. But unfortunately in this lab setup, it doesn't look like we have access to the password policy as the guest user. Using hashcat, I was able to crack those two hashes that we discovered earlier, and we see that carol.carol has a password of Nikita, and aim.erica has a password of happy. So now we can move on to credential enumeration using NetExec. We can verify that aim.erica's credentials work by specifying them with the -u and -p parameter. And here we see that aim.erica is considered a guest user, but if we use carol.carol's credentials, we no longer have that guest flag next to our name. And with these credentials, we're now able to dump the password policy. So the password policy states that we have a minimum password length requirement of 4. The domain password complex flag is set to 0, meaning that it does not require complex passwords, which is why we're able to see passwords like happy and Nikita. We have a locked out duration of 1 minute, but our account lockout threshold is set to none, so we aren't going to be locking out anybody by attempting to brute force passwords. And running the --shares flag with the carol credentials that we've discovered now shows us that we are an authenticated user, and we can now read things like the net logon and sysvol shares. Now that we have some user credentials, we can start talking about SMB share enumeration. We already enumerated all the shares we have access to with the --shares flag, and we see that we have access to common with read-write permissions. But to actually look for files on that common share, we can use the --spider flag, specify common as the share we want to spider, and then we can give it a pattern like txt to look for only txt flags, and you can set this pattern to whatever you like. And it looks like no txt flags exist on the share, so instead what we can do is specify --spider common again, but this time use regex to look for any file, and that can be done by just using a single period. After this run, we see that common has a file called dnsrestart.ps1, so to actually download that file, we can use the --share flag to specify our common share, and then --get-file to download the dnsrestart.ps1 file and name it dnsrestart.ps1. We see it ran successfully and downloaded the dnsrestart file, and if we were to count this file, we see that the password ubersecure password is in plain text. Going back to our share enumeration, we see that we also have the write permission over the common share. So if we wanted to write a file to that share, we could do so by specifying the share using --share, and then using the --put-file flag to put the creds.txt file on that share, called creds.txt. And now if we were to spider that share again, we see that creds.txt exists on the share. Also, now that we're a credentialed user, the --users-export flag should now work, and we may be able to find users we might have missed using the RID brute forcing method. So now with this command, we get a full list of users with every single username, when their password was last set, the number of bad password attempts that they have, as well as their user description in Active Directory. So if we scroll down, we see that Moira.Corny has never had a password set, and they have got a description of company default password reset ASAP. Same thing for Phyllis. We see that the user Bren.Nicolette has their password inside the user description, so that could be a way to do some privilege escalation. And we also find out that Dulce.Daphna is a DNS admin. So this just goes to show that doing the user's export is still worth it even if you think you have all the passwords from RID brute forcing, because you might find users that you might have missed using RID brute forcing, or you may find something sensitive in the description of the user. If you just want to enumerate users that have a user description, we could do that using the LDAP protocol, and using the -M to specify a module, and using the module user-desk, setting for user description to do so. The output is only going to show us users that may have a sensitive description, like containing the word password, but every single user with a user description is saved to a file. In my case, it's saved to home.cali.nxc logs and then the name of the log file, so you can always retrieve the descriptions from this log file as well. In the uncredentialed access portion, we talked about AS-rep roasting, but now that we have credentials, we can now do Kerberoasting. So similar to AS-rep roasting, we specify the --Kerberoasting flag, and then the name of the file we want to save any hashes to. And now we get an output of all of the Kerberoastable accounts that exist on the domain, in this case exchange_service, HTTP_service, and MSSQL_service. And then obviously you try to crack this file using hashcat and the mode 13100, and a word list like rockyou.txt. And in our case here, 2 of those hashes were able to be cracked. Another method we could use to look for more passwords as a credentialed user is using the gpp_password module. This module looks for credential files located in the sysvol share. So from our output, we see that we have read access to the sysvol share because we are a credentialed user, but unfortunately we weren't able to find any XML files containing passwords. No hits this time, but it's still worth doing if you're doing a CTF. A similar module is the gpp_autologin module, which looks for credentials in the registry.xml file on the sysvol share. And the output is going to be similar to the gpp_password command that we ran earlier. Another thing we should do as any user that we compromise is run the --gmsa flag. This is going to look for any group managed service accounts that our current user has access to, which is why it's important to run it as every single user you compromise, because any given user could have access to a group managed service account. Unfortunately, this command fails in my lab environment, but it's still worth checking in your CTFs and penetration testing engagements. Another thing we can do with having write access over a share is using the Slinky module to write a hash stealing file to any writable share. So basically what this is doing is writing a specific file that whenever a user visits the share, will attempt to do an SMB authentication back to a server that we specify. And that authentication involves a handshake where their NTLM v2 hash is sent to our server. So we could take that NTLM v2 hash and try to crack it offline to get their ClearTanks credentials. Or we could try to forward that challenge from the handshake to a server that doesn't have SMB signing enabled to authenticate to that server instead. So to create that file on any writable share against a server, we can specify the -m flag and set it to the Slinky module. And that Slinky module takes in parameters of server, and we're going to set it to the server that we control. And then we can name the file anything we want. In this case, I'm going to name it important. So in the output, we see that we found a writable share called common, and we wrote the LNK file that's going to capture any hashes to that common share. Now we set up a responder on the interface that can talk to the server that we just put the malicious file on. See that the SMB server is up and running. And now on our domain controller as a different user, if we were to go to the common share, we see the important.lnk file is in there. And since that SMB share was opened, the SMB authentication happens and we get that NTLM v2 challenge sent back to us. You could then copy this challenge and save it to a file, and then attempt to crack it with hashcat using the mode 5600 and a wordlist like rockyou.txt. To get all admin users that exist in the domain, we could use the --admin-count flag, and here we see every single user with administrator privileges. If we wanted to check for any users that were susceptible to unconstrained delegation attacks, we could use the --trusted for delegation flag, and this would list out all the users that have unconstrained delegation. In this case, it's just the DC01 machine account. Some things worth mentioning that I don't necessarily have set up in this environment is if we get credentials to a MSSQL server, we could execute queries against that SQL server by using the -q flag and then putting in quotes whatever query we want to run. So here we're running the query select name from master.dbo.sys databases to get the name of all the databases on the SQL server. And if our user had the privileges, we could also attempt command execution by specifying the -x flag and then the command we want to run against the server. So if you're in an environment with a MSSQL server running and you have credentials, I would definitely recommend checking these commands out. And if you have credentials for a local user instead of a domain joined user, you can specify the --local-auth flag to authenticate locally instead. And the last thing I'll show you for credential enumeration using the LDAP protocol, we can check the group membership of any user by specifying the group membership module and setting the user parameter to any user that exists on the domain. So here we're checking the group membership of our own user, and we see that they're in the marketing and domain users group. And just to show you can check the membership of any user, here I've selected the administrator user, and we see that we're in multiple different groups, including administrators, schema admins, domain admins. Now that we've covered the basics of credential enumeration, let's see what we can do specifically as an administrative level user. Here I've specified the user administrator with the password CyberRyan, and we see that our credentials are valid, but this time we get a little pwn note next to our name. This pwn message means that we have some sort of administrative control over the environment or host. And specifying --share shows that we have read-write permissions over the admin and C shares, meaning we could get an administrative shell using something like PSExec. Some other cool things we can do as an administrative user is check what users are logged on to the server using the --logged on users flag. And here we see administrator and the DC01 machine account are both logged into the DC01. We can enumerate all domain computers that exist on the domain by using the LDAP protocol and specifying the --computer flag. Right now in my lab, I only have DC01 set up, so this is the only output. If labs exist in our environment and we have an administrative user, we can specify the -m labs flag to read any labs passwords. We can enumerate all disks or local drives that exist on the server by using the --disks flag. And here we see we have a C and a D drive. This belongs in credential enumeration. As an administrator user, we could dump the local SAM database by using the --SAM flag. And this is going to give us all of the NTLM hashes of the local users on the system. But since this is also a domain controller, we could get the NTLM hashes of every single domain user by specifying the --NTDS flag. And as you can see, we get every single NTLM hash of every user on the domain. If we didn't want all that output and we just wanted the NTLM hash of one user, we could specify the --user flag after NTDS and then the name of the user, and now we get just the output of that specific user. To dump all LSA secrets, we can use the --LSA flag, and this can give us things like DPAPI keys and cache credentials. Lastly, we can do some remote code execution by specifying the -x flag and then the command we want to run. Doing code execution this way is going to get picked up by the antivirus, so unless the antivirus is off, this isn't a good way to get remote code execution. But after turning off the antivirus, we see that we can execute who am I, and we are NT authority system. We could also specify the execution method to either be WMIExec, ATExec, SMBExec, or MMCExec. And we can also execute commands in PowerShell by using the -X flag instead. Now let's talk about some more miscellaneous NetExec modules that exist. To list out every single module that exists for a certain protocol, we can specify NetExec, the protocol, and then -L. And this gives us a list of every single module that we have installed, as well as a quick description of what that module does. So if we wanted to get the machine account quota that exists for our user, we could specify the MAQ module. And what this does is basically tells us the number of computer accounts that our user can create on the domain. So after running this command, we see that our machine account quota is set to 10. So knowing this, we could abuse an attack like resource-based constraint delegation, which requires us to create a machine in the domain to carry out that attack. An interesting SMB module is the getNetConnections module, and this module tells us all of the IPv4 and IPv6 addresses that exist on the host, as well as the domain name. Under the SMB protocol, the KeyPass_discover module is going to look for any KeyPass configuration files or databases. So if KeyPass is used in the environment, this is a great way to potentially find new passwords to crack. And if we have the correct permissions, we can use the RDP module to enable RDP by specifying the parameter action equal to enable. And if we wanted to, we could also disable RDP by just setting the action to disable. And lastly, we have our vulnerability scanner modules. This is used against the SMB protocol, and we can look for vulnerabilities such as zero logon, Petit Patam, NoPack, Shadow Coerce, and Eternal Blue. So for instance, if we wanted to check for zero logon, we would just run -m zero logon, and NetExec will run a vulnerability scan against the server to tell us if we are vulnerable to zero logon. So that's it for this basic tutorial on NetExec and some of its use cases. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And I also have a Discord if you want to reach out to me or the rest of the community. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya.